Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
And you are watching Breakthrough News. Welcome. This is The Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear. My intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek, is out this week. Don't worry, nothing is wrong. She will be back with you very, very soon. And I hope everyone is checking out Dispatches with Rania Khalek on our YouTube page. She's had some great interviews come out recently. And if you need your fix, I would say go straight there and you will get it. But you will just have to put up with only me today, coming to you from the undisclosed bunker location, I'm sure is how it looks like. But this is just showing you that we're going to keep the movement moving on, you know, whether we have one host or two hosts, whether we're in the studio or out of the studio, we're going to keep bringing you all the fantastic content that we always do. And we got a great show lined up for you here today. And since I'm bringing that up, I will also raise with you the fact that we always have great stuff lined up for you. So to make it easier for you to find that quickly, I would advise you to take this time right now, if you're watching on YouTube, to go ahead and hit subscribe, hit the bell so that you get the alerts, make sure that you have your notifications turned on. So that way you don't have to work very hard to get access to the content that you yourself have subscribed to. So go ahead, hit subscribe, hit the bell, turn your notifications on, do whatever you feel you need to do in addition to that to make sure you are following us, you know, put reminders in your calendar. Check us out on social media at BT Newsroom all the time to see things that maybe you missed somehow on YouTube. Whatever it takes, the two of us working together will make sure that you get everything that you need in terms of all of the fantastic content we are putting out. And of course, if you are watching us on Free Speech TV, we don't need you to do anything else other than continue to follow and support Free Speech TV. And a big shout out to the FSTV team, as always, for making it possible for us to appear to you there on that platform. And of course, we are getting into the holiday season. Some might say the giving season. So hopefully, if you are thinking about charitable giving or just doing the right thing here at the end of the year, maybe trying to make it onto Santa's nice list before it is too late, don't forget that you can donate to Breakthrough News in an ongoing way at patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news. And certainly all the existing patrons, big shout out to you. It goes a really long way. There are many great things that you are going to get, including exclusive merch. But most importantly, you will be playing a foundational role in continuing to keep Breakthrough News going and growing, as Rania would say, into 2026 as we close out 2025 strong. And we will be doing more of everything you love and more of things that you're going to love that you can't even expect yet that we have lined up for you in the new year. So to keep us moving forward, definitely your patronage is needed. Patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news. No amount is too large. Certainly, we appreciate anything that anyone can give, of course, and we know these are tough times, so anything people do give is deeply, deeply appreciated. But, you know, also feel free to give very generously if you are able. So shout out to our existing patrons. Shout out to our future patrons. Definitely visit us, patreon.com/breakthrough news. So let's just get right into it here today. A lot going on in the news here. I mean, some people say the news slows down at the end of the year, but certainly not here in 2025. And we want to turn to a very important story, and that is ongoing political turmoil in West Africa, most recently the attempted coup in Benin. But I think there are a number of things flowing from that that are very, very relevant. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Kwesi Pratt Jr., who is the General Secretary of the Socialist Movement of Ghana. As always, Kwesi, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you, Eugene. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's always a pleasure, and we're glad to have you to sort through all this because there's a lot here. Now, you know, when we saw what took place in Benin, the attempted coup attempt there, what we also saw very quickly was moves by ECOWAS to bring in military troops, particularly from Nigeria, and maybe more notably, France, moving very quickly, it seems, some saying at the request of the so-called president of Benin, but really to engage Nigeria and other forces to try to push back. Now, I think the thing that was notable is that when there was a coup in Guinea-Bissau just a couple weeks ago, neither France nor ECOWAS reacted in the same way. So I wonder, from your perspective, Kwesi, what was going on in Benin, and what were these European forces and others in the region seemingly so worried about that they would send in the troops almost right away?
Well, it's clear that ECOWAS is becoming a club of heads of states and has no interest in protecting the interests of the people. Now, this club of heads of states is also beholden to their European puppeteers, and that's what is playing out in Benin. Obviously, from what we're hearing, Macron did call Tinubu of Nigeria to send in troops to quell the coup d'etat. And they moved in very swiftly, and it is obvious that at least they've halted the coup for now. Now, what is interesting is that they claim to be restoring democracy. Now, these leaders who claim to be restoring democracy are themselves quite autocratic. And it is obvious that what they're supporting in Benin is nothing but, an attempt to trample on the rights of the people. First of all, they started to, you understand? So, he's been eroding the democratic rights of his citizens over a long period, and ECOWAS was not interested. But when the soldiers reacted, they quickly jumped in. Now, it's important also to look at the credentials of those behind this attempt to so-called restore democracy in Benin. You take a guy like Alassane Ouattara, and he himself was installed by the French army in a coup against Laurent Gbagbo. Since then, he's amended the constitution on several occasions and now is in office for a fourth term. He's just been sworn in for a fourth term after amending the constitution. Indeed, when the French installed him as head of state, it was obvious that Gardner, who was the guy who mobilized the ragtag army, which provided the front for French intervention in La Côte d'Ivoire, was the number 2 man. Because the Ivorian constitution then said that in the absence of the president, the Speaker of Parliament would act. He quickly amended the constitution and created a position for a premier or a vice president, and quickly went into a fight with Gardner. And today, Gardner is in exile. The guy he himself nominated to succeed him died mysteriously, enabling him to contest elections again, and so on. Now, what is interesting is that these heads of states who claim that they are interested in restoring democracy have all rushed to Abidjan to go and coronate him, for the fourth time. That's sickening. That is sad. It's also obvious that the French interest, in controlling these countries is paramount in their calculations. Now, why would the French be interested in controlling these West African states to the extent of using Nigeria and La Côte d'Ivoire especially, to make an intervention, in Benin? One, France was the colonial power. Today, as we speak, all French-speaking countries in Africa are compelled to deposit their foreign reserves into the Central Bank of France. So you have a situation, these African countries put their money in the Central Bank of France, borrow their own money, and pay interest on their own money that they borrow. Simply doesn't make sense. You take a country like Niger, and before the coup d'etat in Niger was classified as one of the 3 poorest countries in the world. 1 year after the coup, Niger is now classified as the fastest growing economy in the world. What changed? What simply changed is that after the coup, Niger took control of his gold, of his uranium, and of his lithium, and kicked the French out. That alone pushed Niger from a position of one of the 3 poorest countries in the world to the fastest growing economy in the world. Now, it is obvious that if these countries prosper, if these French-speaking countries, Francophone countries prosper in West Africa, it will be to the detriment of France, which has for centuries been dominating their economies, been stealing their resources, and so on. And France doesn't want to lose out. France wants to keep them in this stage of bondage so they can continue to pillage their resources, in order to appease, the working people of France and so on. So this is the situation. I mean, clearly, Ghanaian, Sierra Leonean, Ivorian, and Nigerian soldiers have no business in Benin. What should they be dying for? You understand? There's nothing to die for by this intervention in Benin, apart from entrenching another West African leader who is not interested in the welfare of his people. That's all.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that framing, and it makes me wonder, and if you've already sort of mentioned it, is what this says about the impact of the alliance of Sahel states in West Africa, because it seems to me that the nature of this, at least, attempted coup in Benin, and we'll see what happens in the future, what's already happened in the Sahelian states, the popular movements that are rising in different parts of West Africa, that there is an inflection point that's being reached about what the future of the region is going to be, and that people are being influenced in many different countries by what we've seen happen in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger.
Well, I think it's important to point out that the sub-region is in a flux, and it's difficult to predict how things are going to shape up. Nobody can predict how things are going to shape up. Some significant strides have been made in Niger, in Burkina Faso, and Mali. But there's also a rollback, and that rollback is intensifying. I mean, only recently, fuel supplies to Mali were halted, largely as a result of insurgent attack from IS and other insurgent movements and so on. You understand? The insurgents in the region have become very, very active. They have attacked northern Togo. They've attacked northern Benin. The Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria is growing, it's becoming more audacious, and so on. It's difficult to predict. As we speak, Ukraine has actually admitted, blatantly admitted, that it's supporting the jihadists in Mali. And it claims that it's supporting the jihadists in Mali, its intelligence officers and so on are in Mali supporting the insurgents because Russia is there. I mean, what arrogance, what impudence. I mean, how can Ukraine determine the destiny of a West African country? How can Ukraine be attempting, to overthrow a West African country by supporting insurgents only because it has agreed to work with Russia? The foreign policy of West African countries must be determined by the West African people and not by Ukraine. Understand? So all these forces are played. France is very active. I mean, early in the year, NATO asked Ghana, La Côte d'Ivoire, and Benin to provide it with space to establish drone bases. You understand? As we speak, there's a French garrison in La Côte d'Ivoire. Of course, the garrison in Niger has been thrown out, but there's a French garrison in La Côte d'Ivoire. You understand? The French are very, very active in Benin, in Togo, and so on. So all of these contending forces are present in West Africa. In Ghana, for example, the U.S. has established a forward operating military base in Ghana. So the battle is on, the struggle is on. The forces of progress would win if they emphasize unity and solidarity and increase their vigilance. But there's no telling how things are going to turn out. Already there have been a number of assassination attempts on Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, and all of these are going to continue. We are in a state of resistance against neocolonial penetration into the sub-region.
No, I think that's a critically important point. I mean, we just had the new national security strategy released in the United States. And one of the points they say about Africa is that everything needs to become transactional and based on opening up African countries to U.S. goods and services and securing critical minerals. I mean, you've spoken to this a little bit, but does that feel like the background of what's really happening with the U.S. and Europe and their moves in the sub-region?
Well, that U.S. security strategy, the most frightening thing in that is the claim that Western Europe is facing a civilizational erasure. And the reason they give for that is immigration. That's racist. That's racist. that Europe is facing a civilizational erasure because it's accepting people from Africa and Asia and so on. What can be more racist than that? And indeed, that then forms the basis for the penetration, for the looting of our resources, for the gross disrespect that is being shown to us. And this has been happening for centuries. I mean, what's the difference between this strategy, which was aligned by the White House, and the paper bull of 1452? What's the difference between this strategy, which was aligned, and the Berlin Conference of 1884, where Africa was decided to spheres of influence by the Western capitalist states? So not much has changed. We are still victims. I like also to take a look at what has become known as the Cheney Report. And the Cheney Report apparently was released in 2001, when Bush came to power. The Cheney Report made it clear that U.S. energy requirements, will be met from West Africa because the Middle East had become too dangerous for the U.S. and so on. And that if need be, the U.S. was ready to apply force in order to control our energy resources. That's worrying. That's absolutely worrying, So this is the situation in which we are, and we have no option but to continue to raise our heads up and to try and build independent states in West Africa.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us, Kwesi. And of course, the Socialist Movement of Ghana is on the front lines in all the most important popular struggles across the region. Kwesi Pratt, General Secretary of the Socialist Movement of Ghana, thanks so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you very much. Yeah.
And now that I just let him go, I'm remiss that Kwesi has also just written a new book on reparations. So we'll have to bring him back to talk about that as well. Excellent new text that is out. So definitely do what you can to find that, track that down, and we will help you do that. And we'll keep talking about all these issues happening in West Africa and more. A lot to be said, a lot happening. And I think the next couple of weeks are certainly going to be quite interesting as it concerns many of these different nations and where they go and what the ripple effects are of what just took place in Benin. Now we're going to switch continents, but also critically important issues in Central America, South America, Latin America, the broader Western Hemisphere. There is a lot happening. We mentioned in the last interview the new national security strategy, and certainly that new national security strategy and what's in it is being shown quite clearly, I think, here in the Western Hemisphere with this massive war buildup against Venezuela, which continues to escalate. And of course, Venezuela, not the only country in the crosshairs, a lot to be said from Mexico to Tierra del Fuego. And we are very happy to be joined on the show as we continue our conversation by Kurt Hackbarth, who's a writer and journalist for Jacobin Magazine and the host of the Soberania Mexican Politics podcast, which we're also going to be talking about here. Kurt, thanks for being back with us.
Thanks, Eugene. Always a pleasure back on the show.
Listen, it's a pleasure to be here with you. And, we're closing out 2025. We're now in, I guess, the era of the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and I guess to the Roosevelt corollary too, which I think, we can see. I think everyone is seeing what's happening in Venezuela. Maybe a little bit below the radar, we have Honduras. We have ongoing threats against, everyone from Mexico to Cuba or wherever. I mean, it just really does seem as we're closing out the year here, Kurt, that we are entering into a really ramped up area of U.S. Attempt to roll back sovereignty, which looks a lot of different ways in Latin America. I wonder how you're viewing kind of that 20,000 foot.
Absolutely, Eugene. So you're absolutely right. The National Security Directive is the Monroe Doctrine or the Monroe Doctrine on steroids. So what we see is, right, an escalation across the board in Latin America. The National Security Strategy talks about, reasserting U.S. preeminence, obviously, in the hemisphere. And that's not just idle talk. We've got a quarter of the U.S. Navy in the Caribbean, around the area. We just saw yesterday an absolute act of piracy with the United States boards and robs an oil tanker of oil that was heading from Venezuela to Cuba. Right? And we also see what I call, Eugene, Trump's preventative fraud practices now. Right? It's not just a question of operating fraud at the ballot box or afterwards. But you do, just like in the days when George W. Bush was attempting to push the idea of preventative warfare, which goes against any concept of international law, now we've got a new era in Latin America of preventative frauds. So what Trump and the Trump administration does is it finds the weak points of every country that's about to have an election and pushes the corresponding buttons. With Argentina, it was obviously the bailout and the promise of a $20 billion bailout that was then raised to 40. The Argentines, with their gun to their head, vote for Milei's party, and then Trump, like Lucy with the football to Charlie Brown, pulls the bailout back, at least half, right? With Honduras, you saw something even more perverse, if possible, than playing off of people's economic fears and hyperinflation and the like. What you saw there was not only, the traditional stick of threatening actions on migration and foreign aid, but the most perverse carrot of all possible, which was pardoning Juan Orlando Hernandez, who had been sentenced in the U.S. to a 45-year sentence for trafficking some 400 tons of cocaine into the United States, making deals with El Chapo Guzman to traffic the stuff through Honduras. I mean, one of the worst of the worst. To raise up the National Party candidate, which at that time was in third place, and is now through the whole election into chaos. There's no winner, there's no results, and President Xiomara Castro has said, we have to annul this election, not only because of the failure to produce any kind of result whatsoever, sino because of the obvious and grotesque interventionism of the Trump administration. We could go on, right? Ecuador, the second round there that saw an atypical result with regards to Daniel Noboa that nobody's talking about. It now seems to the point where either electorally or militarily, no country in Latin America is, off the target list. Trump said, if we don't do Venezuela, or we do, then Colombia's next, and then Mexico's next. They didn't have enough targets in Venezuela, so they had to enrich it with targets with Colombia and Mexico, just like back in the day there weren't enough targets in Afghanistan, so they had to add Iraq into the mix. Really troubling times for Latin America, Eugene.
Absolutely, and it seems a big undercurrent is the manipulation, I guess, of the so-called war on drugs. I mean, you've obviously got this sort of fake cartel they've created out of thin air vis-a-vis Venezuela. Then weirdly, they're releasing Joe, who is a drug trafficker, but I guess that has its own reality. And then there's something else I'm hoping you could shed some light on. We've had these federal agents who have been arrested for allegedly, I guess, working with the Mexican drug cartels to launder money. But then the way I read the story, it was like a sting by the U.S. government. So I'm not necessarily saying these people were not corrupt and willing to work with whoever they wanted to work with, but it also seemed in and of itself that there is an element of kind of creating a certain vibe about what's happening in Mexico and about the danger that America is facing from, the quote unquote cartels. I mean, it really does feel, like we're in the 90s again, or this entire war on drugs concept that has been used on both sides of the border to really drive a totally different agenda.
That's absolutely right, Eugene. And that's great that you brought up this whole idea of the cartel of the sun, right? Because this was a CIA vehicle to try to traffic drugs into the United States in an attempt to track the drug routes in the United States, much like, the fast and furious gun running operation into Mexico, which wound up funneling weaponry into the cartel's hands to kill Mexicans, right? So the CIA creates this idea of the cartel of the suns, and then it just kind of falls away, and then they dust it off, pull it off the shelves and dust it off right now in the case of Maduro. Meanwhile, as you point out, we have another and a long list of DEA scandals, right? So, this idea that there's just a few bad apples is not the case at all. It's systematic within the agency. In this case, you have a former DEA agent, Paul Campos, who was running a private consultancy agency, and was approached, as you say, in a kind of a setup, right, a sting, with a former CIA sidekick. And great job, guys, to get nailed in a sting. With all that 25-year experience in the DEA, real bright, right? And he was a former financial officer. So basically the promise was, we can launder your money, because they thought it was the Jalisco New Generation cartel, one of the bloodiest cartels in Mexico. They were going to launder the money through cryptocurrency. That was They said they were all on board, right? Using their experience and contacts that they'd acquired in federal government service. And not only that, they were also planning on supplying what they thought was the Jalisco New Generation Cartel with all kinds of high-grade weaponry. All kinds of high-grade weaponry, including grenade launchers, all the big-ticket items, right? Because they said, we're the ones who can do it. So as we pointed out in the podcast this week, this is part of a troubling trend where former intelligence agency officers go into the private sector after they leave the agencies and wind up becoming consultants effectively for organized crime. When Genaro Garcia Luna, who was the security minister for the conservative government of Felipe Calderon in Mexico, went into private security business in Florida after he left office here, some of his partners were an ex-CIA, an ex-DEA, and an ex-FBI officer because they were close with him. So it's so bizarre, right? Right when they're releasing Juan Orlando Hernandez and right when they're using drugs as an excuse, as a pretext to almost nearly invade Venezuela, you have now another example of former intelligence officers basically moonlighting as private sector consultants to organized crime. Or they would if they weren't busted. That's the state of affairs. I mean, if it were ever clearer that the war on drugs was such a murderous farce, I think, these are a couple of very teachable moments we've had over the last few weeks.
Mm-hmm. No, I think so for sure. Another interesting moment was to see the show of force in the Zocalo in Mexico in support of Claudia Sheinbaum, and of course everything happening with the fourth transformation there, and some interesting new things I know have been announced vis-a-vis the work week, water management. I mean, a number of sort of flurry of announcements to end the year, I think, speaking to the broad thrust of the Mexican government, but of course happening in the context of this, I think, kind of fizzled out now, but Gen Z attempt to, gin up some anger. And I think we've now seen where the people lie there in Mexico. But curious some of your thoughts on that, because it was very interesting to see the hundreds of thousands of people gathering in support of the fourth transformation.
Yeah, we're talking about 600,000 people who turned out last Saturday. I've seen these marches, many of them over the years, and they never cease to surprise me. The ability of the Morena movement to turn people out. I mean, real mass politics in action. Mexico City's Zocalo is, I think, the third largest public square in the world, and they fill it to overflowing, which is no small task. You see some of the images here on the screen. And it's really interesting that this march on Saturday was orders of magnitude larger than the supposed Gen Z march on November 15th, which got all that international coverage, Where was the coverage of Saturday's march? None to be seen. And that's, it's the selectivity of the international press. And so we see malpractice by commission and malpractice, in this case, by omission. They just leave out things that are inconvenient for their narrative. And as you very rightly pointed out, this march coincided with a series of moves in Congress and a series of new announcements. First of all was the national water law, which tightened up the water issue in Mexico. The whole water system in Mexico was privatized back in the early 90s when, the wholesale privatization of the Mexican state, basically. So, wealthy individuals and corporate interests scooped up water licenses, and you created a whole layer of what were called the water millionaires in Mexico, which is a very critical issue right now with climate change and with increasing water scarcity, that you've got water millionaires sitting on water licenses, right? Right now, Trump is threatening Mexico with tariffs again because of a water treaty dating back to the 1940s about shared, rivers and watersheds. And they're saying Mexico's got to give us more water, or, again, the whole tariff, seen over and over through the years. So water is a big issue. So that legislation is going to tighten up the rules on that and, cut back on some of the abuse there. We saw a 13% increase in the minimum wage, which is going to go effect in 2026, which includes the annual minimum wage increases over 7 years that began under López Obrador. We have a push now to get to the 40-hour work week. Mexico still has a 48-hour work week. White-collar workers have 40-hour work weeks, but the blue-collar workers work on Saturdays, and that's been a long-standing tradition in Mexico. So finally, starting in 2027, they're going to start cutting the work week by 2 hours a year to get to the 40-hour threshold by the end of Sheinbaum's government with no cut in pay. That's important. And finally, I think something that Scheinbaum mentioned in her speech is the move to universal health care. Right now, Mexico has a segmented healthcare system where private sector salaried workers go to one system, government workers go to another system, and people who don't fit into either one of those two, who are in the informal sector, are kind of shunted into an inferior third system. And so the idea is that you can have now, everyone will have their card, and you'll have portability between the systems. So you can go into one system to the other, to the other, to the other, which of course the idea is to remove that gap in the quality between the systems and allow everyone to go to the public system that they choose. So some exciting stuff coming out in and around that march.
Well, it brings me to an important topic here. Sobriania, the Mexican politics podcast. Hopefully, I think we have the GoFundMe link. Maybe we can get it up here on the page. You guys are also doing some end of the year reporting, but critically important, I think, Kurt. And I want you to talk about what you all are doing with the show, because as you have, I think, alluded to, in the mainstream media, especially in English, we're getting no reporting, except for a few alternative outlets. So, I mean, what you guys are doing is very important, I think, for not just being informed, but what it's really meaning for the movements that want to change the hemisphere and the Americas for the better.
Yes, thanks so much for that question. So we began, my partner and I, Jose Luis Granado Ceja, began the Soberania podcast at the beginning of 2024 out of the anger that we saw and the frustration of the corporate media coverage. At that time, there was a string of articles coming out in ProPublica and Deutsche Welle and Inside Crime, trying to insinuate that there was some connection between Andrés Manuel López Obrador's first presidential campaign in 2006 and drug traffickers, right? Obviously based on DEA leaks. Nothing substantiated, simply innuendo, and maybe this happened, maybe this occurred, and maybe somebody in the campaign, this or that. Real, again, journalistic malpractice, that they passed off as serious reporting because it's Mexico. What does it matter? What will people know, right? This is the idea. And then the New York Times followed up a month later with another piece about one of AMLO's other presidential campaigns, all based on insinuation, nothing to back it up. But this began a full court press of attacks and social media attacks and bots and loyalty of narco AMLO and narco gobierno and narco this. And it was a very transparent attempt to, again, weaponize the drug and the narco argument to try to undermine a progressive, a presidential candidacy, in this case, that of Claudia Sheinbaum. Fortunately, it didn't work. It actually had a boomerang effect. AMLO's popularity rose 10 points. Sheinbaum coasted into a victory there. But it wasn't for lack of trying. So we began the podcast in that milieu and began, doing our show, little by little. And we were very happy to see how it's grown. This year, we added a new segment called El Taller, which is long-form interview format with people involved in the fourth transformation and analysis and, critiques and, keeping that conversation going. So what we want to do in 2026 is take it to the next step and get out of the studio and into the street. But in order to do that, we need a little bit of help to hire an assistant producer, hire a social media manager, get our clips out there, get our reach improve. We want to get a portable, mini camera kit to get out in the streets, some lavalier microphones. We put it out in the GoFundMe there. The idea is to really create an alternative that, pierces the corporate media lies and doesn't just discuss Mexico, but can expand our coverage to also have a Latin America roundup, kind of like what we did on this segment here, and really broaden our coverage. So anything you could do to, people are watching the show, to be able to throw in, to our GoFundMe for the end of the year, it would be really appreciated. And it's so important because, right, we see the National Security Directive, we see Trump, threatening to invade Venezuela right now at any moment. And then he said Colombia's next, and then Mexico could be next. He says on and off about that, but he wants to drone bomb Mexico. And you see the U.S. corporate media going along with it. I just posted on my Twitter just now, yet another of these vapid national security advisors in CNN saying, absolutely normal to rob an oil tanker, just absolutely normal. And from what I've read of the international law, it's fine, and the U.S. can keep the oil. That's the coverage you're going to get in the U.S. press consistently, right? Across the board, whether it be Fox, whether it be MSNBC and CNN, which is supposedly more democratic outlets. When it comes to Latin America, there's no breathing space between any of these outlets. So it's so important, the spaces you've provided breakthrough in our humble endeavor here to really provide analysis on the ground, informed analysis of what's going on, because we're here in Mexico City. Jose Luis was just in Honduras for the election, so you can't fool him. He was there, right? We're going to try to get to as many places as we can. And so, in summary, that's why we're doing the fundraiser. It's called Empower Soberania's Anti-Imperialist Reporting, and it's right there at GoFundMe. So that's our end of the year pitch, Eugene.
Right on. Well, it's a great end of the year pitch. You guys are doing great work. Soberania, the Mexican Politics Podcast, soon to be even bigger than just that. I will definitely also keep sharing across my social media, so please look out for it. Do it. You can. Kurt Hackbarth, as always, really appreciate you joining us and really looking forward to all the great things you all have coming up in 2026.
Thanks, Eugene. Tarania as well. Looking forward to 2026.
Mm-hmm. Well, critically important work that is happening there. They're there in Mexico City. They're all around. Kurt, of course, you can check out his byline all over the place. Jacobin, he's in many different places, so please do. And if you are a Spanish speaker, he's all over some great programs, including some with our friend Elena Duarte there in Mexico on public television. So there is good independent alternative media. You got to go looking for it a little bit, but once you find it, make sure that you pass it on so that individuals who maybe don't know about what's going on can get better informed. And we, of course, want to better inform you about some critically important issues regarding your pocketbook, so to speak. And that is in regards to the price of groceries and really, I have to say, must follow report from More Perfect Union Consumer Reports and Groundwork about Instacart and other things about grocery prices and what that says about the use of AI and what we're all facing in some pretty tough times here in terms of the cost of living crisis. And we are very, very honored to be joined for this conversation by Eric Gardner, who's a business reporter for More Perfect Union. Eric, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, great to have you. And an alarming report that you all were able to do, at least alarming for, I think, those of us who aren't millionaires, about how Instacart is dealing with the issue of prices. And, I think maybe to frame this to start, I think a lot of people, we know we're in a time of great inflation for prices. And you think, okay, I go in this week and XYZ cost whatever it costs. Maybe if I go in a month, it's going to cost more. So people have some idea that, prices are going up. But this isn't just like, you go in 1 month and it's one price, you go in next month and the next price. This is a more extreme manipulation that we seem to be seeing from your reporting at More Perfect Union around Instacart in real time, really, really price gouging people in a way that they don't even often know about.
Yeah, definitely. So what this was, as you mentioned, with collaboration with Consumer Reports and Groundwork Collaborative, we started off with kind of a simple question. Is Instacart charging different people different prices for the same products at the same time? And to test that, we got about 400 people in a room, 400 people across 4 different tests. And the answer is resounding, yes, they are. And it's not just like small minor differences. Like according to the website, they claim that it's kind of small differences. It's 20% a lot of the time, and about 3/4 of all products that we tested had price differences.
Wow, that's amazing. Maybe just give us some examples of what you all saw with the people you were sending in, because I think to underline the point you just made, we're talking about the same products in the same place at the same time, all being sold for different prices.
Yeah, absolutely. So with eggs, in one test, there was 5 different prices for eggs, ranging from about $3.99 to about $4.79. For wheat thins, there was about 4 prices for wheat thins, ranging again from about $4 to $4.89. So just trying to test basically what people are willing to pay. Peanut butter was the same, 3 prices for peanut butter. It's really kind of across the whole, every item you can think of, more or less. Again, 3/4 of the items that we tested had different prices for different consumers at the same time.
And, one of the things that was interesting in the report to me is that in the earnings reports and other things like that, Instacart seemed to be suggesting that, not only that they are doing this, but that this is actually something that grocery stores should really like because it's increasing their profits.
Yeah, absolutely. So what Eversight did, and it's pretty unique within the industry, my background's in grocery pricing, is that typically all of this type of analysis was done kind of like backwards looking. They would take a bunch of historical data and they would try to model out, if we increase this price, how much, what would the impact be? What Eversight did is, let's actually stop thinking about like hypotheticals and just test prices, these small, quote unquote, small little increases and see what happens. And so, it's definitely a value prop that they sell to retailers and food companies kind of across the whole food ecosystem.
And what, obviously the hot conversation now is AI. And I think also anyone who's using a phone, just the sort of surveillance and tracking and data sales and things that are going on with all the different apps that you're using. I mean, how does this really sort of cross into that conversation? I mean, one of the phrases you all use is that people don't even know they're being used in the context of a lot of this data.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's kind of the root of this story. When you see a lot of reporting on AI, it's typically done in the sense of like this idea of artificial general intelligence or, curing cancer. And like, certainly my understanding is there's a lot of, promising things within drug development with AI. AGI is, basically nonsense. But like the reality of the situation when you come to artificial intelligence is that its practical use is what we found. It's going to be powerful companies who have kind of existing fixed assets that have a lot of market power, and they're going to use that market power to basically extract as much from consumers as they can and extract as much from suppliers as they can. And it used to be, there was obviously some analysis around it, trying to figure out prices, but now there are tens of thousands, if not millions of different data points that are going into systems really to optimize this price all around profit.
And, I think this is an important issue, and you pointed it out, because the market power is substantial. I mean, it seems that one other major issue here, and obviously you all studied Instacart, so, we can't say anything definitively about anyone else, but just that type of securing groceries is becoming bigger and bigger, whether we're talking about Amazon or even, some of the companies themselves that are running different things online, like the app-based grocery delivery that this is really rooted in, this report, is something that seems to really be scaling.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been interesting. So talking with a lot of ex-colleagues and folks, both before and after this has been, went public, and it's basically, you're at the tip of the iceberg here. Whether or not it's the same mechanism that Eversight or Instacart, that we found, it's definitely happening. Again, is it the same mechanism? Not sure, but it's this type of analytics, this type of technology is being used at scale in grocery industry. And you're right, it's scary because it's food. And, you talk to a lot of, former Eversight employees, and they'll talk about how kind of instead of letting a category manager decide a price, it's letting the people vote with their pocketbook. But it's like, it's groceries. That's not how it works. Like, this isn't a perfect market. People realistically, they're not going to drive 25 minutes out of the way to save 10 cents on something, but you're still going to keep on pushing the price over and over and over again over time. It's it's certainly worthy of investigation.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's an important point. And I think, just in the context that you all were putting it in, is that food inflation is very significant. It's over other inflation. I mean, do we have any sense just generally on the kind of cost this could inflict on someone, in terms of what they could be facing because of this in terms of extra costs?
Yeah. The report, and using kind of Instacart's own data for, what an average family spends on grocery, the estimate was a little over $1,000. I believe about $1,200 for a family of four over the course of a year is what this could potentially cost.
Wow, that's amazing in the midst of everything else rising. And I think the question that people always ask themselves in these moments is they feel so powerless, because obviously they're these huge corporations. It's the only place you really have to buy food. Like, is there anything you can do about it? I mean, are there policy pieces that are out there that can address this, or is this something that still needs to be developed because we're also dealing with cutting edge technology?
That's a great question. From a policy perspective, I think that since this is food, I feel like all options should be on the table. I'm certainly, to start, number one, we need an investigation. As the report says, it's probably not going to come from the federal government. I would say the good news is a lot of state AGs are very, very interested in this. And so I certainly think something could be coming. But in general, this is food. And of course, there's real inflation happening, but then there's things like this that are driving it upwards, this kind of ratcheting it up. And it seems like almost, no option should be off the table right now.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very well taken point. And I mean, yeah, we always say food, clothing, shelter. I mean, this is really one of the most important things that you can buy. As someone who is working who has worked in this industry, who has seen this pricing, who has seen this, I mean, does this feel, I mean, it's obviously it accelerated because of the way they can use the technology, but do you also feel like there's been a culture shift that the technology has allowed within the industry to make it perhaps more predatory?
I would say yes, and it was both technology and just like COVID. I cannot stress. So I left industry 2022. I cannot stress how pre-COVID, how afraid brands were, and my experience is mostly with food companies, afraid of raising prices. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But then COVID happened and everyone kind of realized we can raise prices. And so it's kind of just unleashed this thing where there was this industry that was really kind of held in check by inertia, as I say in the video, that really got unleashed into COVID. And now, trying to untangle this box and put it back into where it could be, where people can actually afford food at a normal rate. It's a huge problem. And it's going to take a whole lot of investigations and a whole lot of work to get it back to normal.
Well, like I said, this was quite eye-opening for me, especially as someone who, uses some of these services. But I just wonder, for people who are watching this, we're going into the holiday season, so this is going to be a big topic of discussion, people buying lots of food for friends and family or whatever. If there's anything you want people to take away from this investigation in particular, one big takeaway, what do you think that would be that they should share with others?
I would say that understand that prices in general, specifically with the grocery industry, it's no longer a retailer identifying a price and trying to get a little profit to keep things running and pay shareholders. Every time you walk into a store, there's a good chance that this is a test. You're just not buying groceries. You're being analyzed, evaluated to figure out what's the optimal price that they can pay. And, the industry, of course, is going to say, I'm expecting this kind of pushback around this report that, this is around offering lower prices, finding out where we can lower. And it's of course, there's certain groceries that every grocer wants to be competitive, but it's the rest. It's the 95% of the rest, which is the part that I'm afraid of.
No, that's been, and one thing I did want to ask you before I let you go here, but that you just reminded me of the way that discounts can be used in a very misleading manner in terms of how it makes people perceive the prices too, is I thought an interesting part of what you all found.
Yeah, definitely. And we're continuing along that investigation. There's a whole kind of discount kind of web here within the industry, but it really raises the question. So if, the industry in general, like Kroger has admitted to this, Instacart admitted to this, that they use, not personal, behavioral characteristics to offer different promotions to people. And my question for that is, but they deny doing that for the list price itself, the basic price that you see on the shelf. So my question is, what is a promotion if the list price isn't static? Right. Like what are we actually talking about? I guess is there's a lot of evasive, I would say, language and framing here. And really the only way we're going to get an answer is with some type of investigation.
Well, hopefully that'll be forthcoming. And at least we do have the media investigations from organizations like yours at More Perfect Union, where you are reporting Consumer Reports and Groundwork Collaborative to put together this very interesting report on Instacart. Everyone has to check out the video, read the report. Very, very interesting. Eric Gardner, you are a business reporter from More Perfect Union. We really appreciate you coming on and helping us sort through all this.
Thank you so much. Anytime.
Yeah, really amazing. Go check out More Perfect Union. They've got a video version. If you go to the Groundwork page, Groundwork Collaborative, they have a text version. So it's all bringing in the same information, different ways, and share it around with people, because it really is quite notable about the way technology, just generally commerce and capitalism and all these things are working and conspiring against us at a time where food inflation is significant. I believe it's something like since 2020, the average increased cost of groceries is something like 25%. I might be getting that wrong, but very, very significant. And the level of profiteering, and I'm so glad that Eric brought up the issue of COVID, is insane. It's intense. I mean, the Economic Policy Institute has done a number of different studies, as has Groundwork actually, about, in terms of inflation, the percentage of every dollar of inflation, let's say, that goes to corporate profits. And, there's different ways to measure that over different years, but anywhere from roughly 30 to roughly 50%. So roughly 30 to roughly 50 cents out of every dollar of inflation is actually going towards corporate profits. And I certainly would surmise that it's policies like this, like Instacart messing around with the prices. And this is why you really got to look at it like same product, same place, like same store, same city, same time. And, using these sorts of things, a little incremental things, step by step, 10 cents here, 5 cents there, 25 cents there, $1 there, all these different pieces going up, going down to manipulate the prices, to test what your endurance level is in terms of paying more money, sometimes more money than you have, in order to make significant amounts of profits. And the level of profiteering is it's quite substantial. And I think that it's one of these things that has been totally, washed out. Of course, in the context of the election in 2024, they said that inflation was a result of government spending. That's why the Build Back Better bill did not pass in Congress under Biden. I mean, it had its own problems, but it had a number of good things in it too. They said it was going to cause inflation, and that the spending to basically keep people from, dying on the street and being kicked out of their homes in the context of the COVID relief programs, that had driven inflation. But then when you really start to look at it and you really start to look at these reports, so much of it is the drive up of these corporations that know that that, and I say you, me too, who knows how much it costs to make anything, to ship anything, to do all these other things. You think, we got these supply issues, we've got, this, that, and the third happening all over the place. You don't know what's going on. So even though it might seem unfair, and in your mind, it might think, okay, well, yeah, if it went up 50 cents, maybe they did need to add more money, or gas is more expensive, or whatever it may have been. And then it turns out that they didn't need to do any of that at all. They're just taking you for a ride because they know that they can. And I think that is one of these things that we all want to believe the best about everyone, but the reality is these big corporations are out for their bottom line. So anyway, please do check out that report from More Perfect Union, Consumer Reports, and Groundwork Collaborative about Instacart and the use of price manipulation to drive up profits. Now, before we get out of here today, we want to turn to another issue, and that is the National Security Strategy 2025. Now, there's a lot of talk about the National Security Strategy 2025. Of course, these national security strategies come out, there's like one every presidency. And to be honest with you, they're pretty much all the same. I believe I don't know actually how long they've been coming out. I can say I have been reading them, not since 1991, but I have been following posthumously, I don't know if that's the right word, since 1991. I wasn't that old in 1991 to read the real one, but I've been looking since then. So at least since then, they've been doing these national security strategies, and they're basically all the same. They all have different verbiage. They have different, ways of shading certain things, different emphasis, but they all, from the very first one, which, infamously is often called, the very first one I tracked, infamously called the Wolfowitz Doctrine, because it was a leaked memo by Paul Wolfowitz, if you remember him, the neocon, that actually came out showing that he had written this strategy, or they had written this strategy in the government to dominate the entire globe. And since then, they all are the same. They might be posed differently or framed differently, but it's all about the United States dominating the entire globe. No matter what, every other country has to be completely and totally subordinate to the United States. So here we are in 2025. Trump is coming in. He's got the new National Security Strategy 2025. A lot of people are talking about it for many different reasons. And one of the things that I want to really get into here, because this is not going to be a full comprehensive discussion of that. We're going to have to continue to discuss it, in the coming weeks, which is a reason to keep following Breakthrough News. But to go through some just basic issues here, because I think that there are some serious misnomers going on around this national security strategy, some of which, of course, are nested within the strategy in and of itself. Like, they say they want to have a bias towards non-intervention, that they want to move away from the globalist agenda, so on and so forth. I mean, a general thrust that we've also heard from conversations from everyone from J.D. Vance to Pete Hegseth, who you can see here, to Trump himself, to others within the MAGA movement, that they want to sort of pull back from what we've seen since the post 9/11 era of what some people have come to call the forever wars. Not that the United States has not been doing imperial things before that, but this is extreme, $1 trillion military machine with hundreds of bases all across the world, intervening, sanctioning, all these other things. That this may be some sort of pullback from that, in particular as it concerns China and Russia, which had previously been the two, main entities, main countries listed in these past national security strategies as like the number one enemies of the United States. And a lot of the language is very different. It's certainly different from Biden's national security strategy, most recent one, which was like very bellicose towards those two countries in particular, and didn't leave any ambiguity. So I just want to walk through a few things here just to talk about what's really happening, because the reality is, new empire, same as the old empire. And anyone who's telling you that this national security strategy is some sort of pullback, some sort of rollback, some sort of moderation is just either willfully ignorant or deliberately lying in order to hide the truth about what's happening, which you can see in Congress, which has just passed yet another $1 trillion military budget. And, by the way, the national security strategy said it wants to end the war in Ukraine, where they're sending hundreds of millions more dollars to Ukraine in this national security strategy. They're doing this massive buildup of military force there in Venezuela. Already cost probably billions of dollars, but believe it or not, in this, they're adding $1 billion more for these so-called drug interdiction efforts that are, just what we've seen with this lawless war criminal type bombing of the boats. I could go on, but let's get to the national security strategy itself. I don't want people to be able to throw sand in your eyes. So just to start, if you look at the opening lines, Now, I got some notes here because I got to read this to you exactly. The opening lines of the national security strategy say it all, that the main goal of the United States government from the perspective of the Trump administration is, quote, to ensure that America remains the world's strongest, richest, most powerful, and most successful country for decades to come. I'm going to read that again to you. To ensure that America remains the world's strongest, richest, most powerful, and most successful country for decades to come. So just right there, I don't know what else you could call that but an extreme imperialist policy. The goal of the United States national security strategy, according to the Trump administration, is to make sure all other countries remain subordinate to the United States in economic power and in military power and in all other forms of power for decades to come. All other nations must remain subordinate to the United States for decades to come. All other nations must be held down to make sure the United States is the strongest, richest, most powerful, most successful country for decades to come. So no matter what else they're saying, no matter what other little things in there, non-intervention, whatever it may be, clearly they are trying to dominate the globe and to subordinate all other countries to the U.S. whims to make sure that the U.S. stays on top of all other countries and can dictate to them what their policies may be. Now, just that sentence that I read to you there, to ensure that America remains the world's strongest, richest, most powerful, and most successful country for decades to come, obviously implies force and coercion if anyone gets any other ideas about what they should be doing. Now, am I saying that? No, they're saying that. They even have a subhead. It says, what are America's available means to get what we want? Well, they note one thing amongst a list of things, quote, the world's single largest and most innovative economy, which both generates wealth, we can invest in strategic interest, and provides leverage over countries that want access to our market. Another thing on that list that they have under the subhead of what are America's available means to get what we want? The world's most powerful and capable military. So just think about that for a second. Just in the very beginning, they're saying that the goal is to ensure that the U.S. is the top country and that all other countries must remain subordinate to the United States. How are they going to get that? Well, they can sanction people, they can deny access to the economy, they can bribe people with access to the economy, and if push comes to shove, they have the world's most powerful and capable military. So just right there in the beginning, you can see from the goal that they have set out in the very first sentence of the document to the means in which they are saying that they can carry this out, that they are willing to dominate the entire world. And if anyone gets any other ideas, force and coercion, from sanctions to boycotts to bribes to invasion to regime change, is on the table. So they say they have a bias towards non-intervention. Maybe that sounds good to some people when you read the national security strategy, but what they're saying is, maybe in a perfect world, we won't have to intervene anywhere, because as long as these countries behave, we won't do anything. But if they get any ideas about America not being the world's strongest, richest, most powerful, most successful country, we will use force and coercion to force them to do that. And you can see that as we go through some of the areas, especially Latin America, which we already mentioned, where they are saying that they are going to establish the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, sometimes you got to love how open they are. They are saying the quiet part out loud. I mean, of course, the Monroe Doctrine is relatively well known to many people. It dates to the 1820s. President James Monroe, and he basically put out the Monroe Doctrine to say European countries shouldn't really be dealing in Latin America in any significant way. Or let me put it like this, that insofar as they're investing and economically investing in Latin America and so on and so forth, that the U.S. is their agent in the hemisphere. And if there's any sort of dispute between European powers and Latin American countries, many of which were newly independent, it's the U.S. that will, take care of everything for you. No European military. Europe doesn't have any writ here. Now, the Trump corollary is a play on what was called the Roosevelt corollary that was put in by Theodore Roosevelt in 1904. And that's what I think is even more important, because since they're calling it the Trump corollary, they're obviously trying to draw an identity of interest here. Now, of course, or historical linkage here between the two. Now, the Roosevelt corollary is the same basic thing as the Monroe Doctrine, except it very explicitly stated that the United States would invade any other country in Latin America that did not do what the U.S. government wanted. I mean, it's that blunt. You can go and you can read it. And they're basically saying, if these countries do what we want, everything's fine. And if they don't do what we want, we will invade these countries. And the Roosevelt corollary, of course, was used to, as the justification to invade Haiti, to invade Nicaragua, many different countries in the region. So it was a directly interventionist policy. So saying the U.S. controls Latin America, and if Europe doesn't like it, too bad, too sad. And if Latin American countries themselves want sovereignty, well, we're not going to allow that. And of course, you can see that in the exact words about the so-called Trump corollary. Quote, they want to, quote, restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. To protect our homeland and our access to key geographies throughout the region, we will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities or to own or control strategically vital assets. Now, obviously, non-hemispheric competitors refers to China, which does a lot of trade with Latin American nations. And, what is a threatening capability and positioning it? What is a strategically vital asset? Just like the Roosevelt corollary, if you go back and read it, was relatively vague about what exactly it meant in terms of the specific actions. It's giving you a broad umbrella as this is. You do too much trade with China, you let China do too much around you, maybe other countries that you want to deal with. I mean, you look at the context of Venezuela and they're saying they don't like how Venezuela has relations with Iran. They don't like how Venezuela has relations with this or that country. If you do the wrong thing, you have the wrong friends, you have the economic deals that maybe we don't like, well, that means that we are going to enforce against you a change in policy, which is exactly what we are seeing right now in Venezuela, so you don't have to imagine it. So again, it says in there they have a bias towards non-intervention, and there are some people out here trying to claim that this national security strategy is a step back from the forever wars or U.S. imperial policy. But as you can see in Venezuela, connect that to the words that they're putting in the document. As it concerns the Western Hemisphere, they are 100% on record and in reality saying that governments we do not like, we will use force and coercion, from boycotts like the criminal blockade of Cuba to what we've saw with the seizing of the ship in Venezuela, to what we've seen with the sanctions on Venezuela and on Nicaragua, to what we've seen with the threats of drone strikes against countries like Mexico, what we've seen with this massive military buildup, the push for open CIA operations and over regime change, the use of money to bribe countries and to manipulate voters in Argentina and Honduras and other places, that they will use any means, fair or foul, by hook or by crook, to overthrow any government inside of Latin America that refuses to be subordinated to the U.S. whims and the U.S. writ. And they are openly putting in the national security strategy that they are continuing the policy from James Monroe on, the Trump corollary, to treat the U.S. as the front yard, the backyard, the upstairs, the downstairs, and the basement, totally under American control will Latin America be, or they will use force and coercion no matter what they say about being against regime change wars. And that's something that you can see that's really, throughout the entire document that you can see here. I mean, as it concerns Africa, for instance, one of the main points that they make is that they want to move towards a trade and investment focused relationship with Africa, which ultimately means things like favoring partnerships with states that are committed to opening their markets to U.S. goods and services. That's a quote there. So if you want to open up your market to be flooded with cheap American goods and to be dominated by U.S. banks and other, Price Waterhouse Cooper and all these, consultancies and all these other people, then you're going to get sort of preeminent partnership. I don't know what kind of partnership it is when that means you're opening up and allowing your economy to be completely and totally dominated by U.S. free trade policies, but that's what they're going to do. They also say that they want to work with countries that are going to allow them to access critical mineral technology in particular, and that this is a big focus on helping them with their competition for critical minerals, which means competition with China. And we can see what that looks like just by looking at DRC, where the so-called peace deal, which isn't much of a peace deal whatsoever, is predicated on a deal between the US, DRC, and Rwanda to give the United States access over critical minerals that are there in the eastern part of the DRC. There are at least rumors that they're trying to do a similar deal there with Sudan. You can see what happened with the aggressive economic attack on South Africa that took place, which was 100% designed towards getting them to modify their policies that allow South Africa to gain at least some element of wealth from things like platinum and other industries that they have there that they are working in relationship with the United States. So, in Africa, same old neocolonialism is what the national security strategy is promoting. And I mentioned the critical minerals issue with China and the competition that they're saying, because this is one of the issues that people say, they're pulling back. And you had Pete Hegseth a couple, weeks, maybe it was a month before this came out, out saying the thing that I'm talking to the Chinese military and I'm telling them we don't want to overthrow them, and we don't want to have the same level of we want to respect them and this, that, and the third. And even if it's a competition, blah, 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 blah. But the reality is the policy is the same policy towards China, and that is to contain and kneecap China's economic rise. And that is just 100% there in terms of the words that are on the screen. I mean, in the national security strategy, when it talks about one of the China section, which is Asia, is almost all about China, you just have to look at what they're saying, that one of their main goals is to, quote, safeguard our prime position in the world economy. Well, what else could that mean than preventing China from rising to a level that is equal to the United States? Which, of course, why would they do that? Because the main goal is to ensure that America remains the world's largest, the strongest, richest, most powerful, and most successful country, and all others must be subordinate to it, including China. So one of the main goals, they say the economy is at the top, to safeguard our prime position in the world economy. Again, to essentially, by hook or by crook, make sure China's economy does not continue its inexorable rise, or what seems like an inexorable rise, at least relative and vis-a-vis to the United States. It also states, quote, to ensure that allied economies do not become subordinate to any competing power. Well, that's obviously talking about China in and of itself. So saying that they don't want any other country in Asia to actually have any sort of significant economic relationship with China. They also say that, quote, we will build a military capable of denying aggression anywhere in the first island chain. Now, the first island chain is like Japan, Taiwan, parts of the Philippines, some of the other little small islands. So, I mean, that's just like a physical containment strategy. Like, even though the United States is thousands of miles away from China, we are going to put all of our military forces in this first island chain. They also say in there, by the way, that one of the things they want to force their allies in the first island chain to do is give them more access to military bases. I don't even know how that's possible. I mean, they have unlimited access to military bases in Japan and South Korea. So they must just mean in the Philippines to increase the militarization, especially in the Northern Islands, which they already have been doing in and of itself, to create a physical barrier to go along with what they say is one of their main, quote unquote, security challenges, which is to the potential for a competitor, quote unquote, to control the South China Sea. So again, United States, thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away from China, is saying that it's going to use a huge amount of military power, whatever they need to do, a military capable of denying what they call aggression, to make sure that China can have no influence in its own region, and that all the countries that most immediately surround China are a part of a US-led massive military buildup to contain China inside of this area. So both economic containment, kneecapping their economy to safeguard the fact that the US will remain the strongest, richest, most powerful, most successful country for decades to come, and a military strategy to enforce that, to say, if you try to do anything different than what we want you to do, we are going to make sure that you can't do that, and we are going to have a $1 trillion military to prevent it. And just to close, one of the issues is Russia. Because when you look at the European section of the national security strategy, and you look at the context, and you look at even what's happening in the war in Ukraine, there are some that say, oh, well, Trump, he's pulling away from Russia. He's pulling away from NATO. He's moving away from these terrible policies. And they even write some stuff in there. They say we want to move away from the idea that NATO is just going to expand forever. And I mean, okay, they've expanded right up to Russia's borders, and now they're like, hey, but by the way, we're not going to go too much further. Maybe we won't let Ukraine join, but we're going to be right there. But what's notable is the words they use. They say that they want to restore, quote, strategic stability with Russia. Okay, that's interesting. Well, what could that mean? Well, I think we have to recognize that it means the same thing that the 1991 Wolfowitz Doctrine meant, which is that any relations with Russia that are good have to be predicated on Russia understanding that they have to, like every other country, subordinate themselves to U.S. dictates. And that we can have trade relations with them, we can do this, we can do that, but it's under the guidelines that the U.S. creates. And that there's going to be a counterweight in case Russia gets any other ideas. And that counterweight is going to continue, even in the post-Soviet era, to be NATO. Which is why in the national security strategy, they note they're not leaving NATO, not getting out of NATO. In fact, they're saying, we want to stay in NATO and have U.S. troops over there, but they just want all the NATO countries to spend 5% of their GDP on defense. So that means that strategic stability with Russia, quote unquote, is predicated on Russia recognizing that the United States, which has this massive $1 trillion military and enough nuclear weapons to destroy the whole world, is now going to facilitate $1 trillion military buildup in Europe that is going to be facilitated through NATO, so directly adjacent to the Russian borders, that is going to put on their border a U.S. garrison state whose politics are going to be subordinated as well to the U.S. political dictates, which they talk about in Europe, which means that they will exist as a counterweight in case Russia gets some other ideas that maybe America should not be the world's strongest, richest, most powerful, and most successful country for decades to come. So it's like, yeah, we recognize that maybe Ukraine was a bridge too far and we can't sustain this direct confrontation with Russia, but we're still going to bottle them up. We're still going to kneecap their main economic ally in China. And we're going to make sure that Europe in and of itself is such a powerful military combined with the United States that you better not get any other ideas, Russia. Then you can do business with us, sure, but you better not think that you're going to have too much influence. And just to add, one of the major factors in keeping Europe on side is, one, a total free market economy. So just, a smash and grab raid by US corporations on the European economy, but also that Europe remain white. Yes, that is correct. They are saying that one of the biggest challenges for the United States and Europe is that within a few decades at the latest, certain NATO members will become majority non-European, that they want Europe to remain European, to regain civilizational self-confidence. So essentially, the European strategy is to create a white ethno-state with $1 trillion military buildup. Some of those nations, of course, have nuclear weapons, to work in direct conjunction with the United States with a shared philosophy of free market fundamentalism sitting right up against Russia's border to remain so-called strategic stability in the context in which they're trying to surround China and do other things like that to prevent the U.S. from losing preeminence. So if that's stepping back from the brink, I don't really know what that means. I guess I got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you if you really think that. End of the day, just remember the original lines. To ensure that America remains the world's strongest, richest, most powerful, and most successful country for decades to come. All other countries must remain subordinate to what the U.S. ruling elites and the government under their power decides it wants to do. And you can only act inside of that framework. New empire, same as the old empire. National security strategy, same as all the rest. Don't forget it. The U.S. is trying to be the global world policeman to control every corner of the globe, to make a tiny percentage of people very, very rich, while the vast majority of us in the United States and in the world continue to suffer. Let's just remember today, as I'm talking to you on December 11th, Congress couldn't even pass money to keep millions of people from having their healthcare costs double, but they could pass money for $1 trillion to make sure they can dominate the globe. That's the National Security Strategy 2025. And that's going to be our show for us here today on the Freedom Side here and Breakthrough News. And of course, Rania Khalek was out today. She will be back with us very soon. We've got a lot of things coming up for you here in the end of the year. We got a lot of great things coming up for you in the early part of next year. So I would ask you, if you are so inclined, if you can, whatever you can do, please go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news and become a patron, become an ongoing donor, become one of our foundational cornerstones for us to, as Rania would say, keep going and growing into 2026, where we've got a great slate of new, exciting things and even more of all the things you love. So big shout out to all of our guests. Big shout out, of course, to all of our existing patrons. Big shout out to all of you who are watching. Big shout out to the whole Breakthrough News team behind the scenes that makes this show possible. For myself, for Rania Khalek, for everyone at Breakthrough, we will see you next time.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.